The cold night air seeped through the cracks of the window, but she barely felt it. She had grown used to being invisible, used to blending into the background while her family's world revolved around her younger sister. It had always been that way. Her sister, the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, the one her parents praised and protected as if she were made of delicate glass. And then there was her, the one who had to be responsible, had to sacrifice, had to always put her sister first. She never complained. She had convinced herself long ago that this was just how love worked. If she gave enough, if she was patient enough, if she proved her worth, one day they would see her. One day they would love her the way they loved her sister. That day never came. She watched from the corner of the room as her parents fussed over her sister's latest achievement. Another trivial milestone that they made seem like the greatest accomplishment in the world. She had worked just as hard, harder even, but her efforts were met with silence. She wasn't bitter. Not anymore. She had learned to swallow the pain, to let it settle deep in her chest where no one could see it. And then everything changed in an instant. The flames started small, a flickering glow that barely seemed real. But within moments, smoke curled into the air, thick and suffocating. The heat followed, pressing against her skin, stealing the oxygen from the room. Panic spread through the house. Her mother screamed. Her father shouted orders. Her sister cried, demanding someone save her. No one thought about her. No one ever did. She should have run. She should have thought of herself, but old habits died hard. Even in the face of death, she thought of them first. She rushed toward her sister's room, her lungs burning with every breath, her vision blurred by the thick smoke. She could barely see, barely move, but she pushed forward. Her sister was cowering in the corner, sobbing, waiting to be saved. And so, she did what she had always done. She gave everything. She wrapped her arms around her sister, guiding her through the flames, shielding her from the falling debris. She didn't stop, didn't hesitate, even when she felt her strength beginning to fail. The front door was so close. She could see the faint glow of lights outside, hear the distant sound of sirens. She just had to make it a few more steps. And then pain. A sharp, crushing force as a burning beam collapsed from the ceiling, slamming against her back, trapping her. Her sister screamed, but she didn't stop moving. She pushed her forward, forcing her to run. Go. The last thing she saw was her sister stumbling toward their parents, safe. And then everything went dark. For a moment there was nothing. Just emptiness. Silence. The overwhelming sense of finality. She had always known she was expendable to them. But she thought, just this once, her sacrifice would mean something. Maybe now they would see her. Maybe now they would finally love her. But then, through the suffocating haze of her fading consciousness, she heard them. Is she okay? Her mother's voice, frantic with worry. A warm feeling spread through her. A tiny sliver of peace before the darkness could fully take her. They care. And then, I can't believe this happened, her father said, voice thick with emotion. She wanted to cry. They saw her. They finally saw her. But then, her leg. Look at her leg. She's hurt. Not her. Not the daughter who had just given her life for them. Not the one who had fought through the flames, who had suffered, who had saved them. They were talking about her sister. Her sister's leg. She felt something inside her crack, something deeper than bone, deeper than flesh. She'll be fine, her father assured. Her mother's voice was softer now, relieved. At least we still have her. The words cut deeper than the flames ever could. At least we still have her. Not at least she tried. Not she was so brave. Not she saved us. At least we still have her. She had died for them. And they hadn't even noticed. The darkness finally swallowed her. And this time she let it. But fate was not done with her yet. Because when she opened her eyes again, she was not dead. She was somewhere else.
Somewhere familiar.
Her old bedroom. She sat up quickly, her heart pounding, her hands shaking as they pressed against her skin. She was whole. She turned toward the mirror. The reflection staring back at her was younger.
No scars. No burns.
She touched her face, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. And then the realization crashed into her like a tidal wave. She had been given a second chance. She was back. Back before the fire. Back before she had wasted her life for a family who would never see her. Back before she had died for nothing. A slow, bitter smile curled on her lips. This time, she wouldn't make the same mistake. The world felt different. Softer. Quieter. She could feel the warmth of sunlight against her skin, the faint scent of lavender drifting through the air. For a moment she thought she was dreaming. The last thing she remembered was the fire, the crushing weight of debris pinning her down, the suffocating heat closing in. She had fought so hard, had given everything to save them. And yet, in the end, she had died alone. Her final moments spent listening to the words that shattered her more than the flames ever could. At least we still have her. The words rang in her head like a cruel echo. They hadn't mourned her. They hadn't even noticed she was gone. Her body jolted upright, panic flooding through her veins. She gasped, expecting pain, expecting the burns, the broken bones, the suffocating weight of death. But when she looked down at herself, she was whole. Her hands trembled as they roamed over her arms, her legs. Her legs. They were both there, unscarred, strong. Her breath came in sharp, uneven gulps as she took in her surroundings. This wasn't the hospital. This wasn't the cold emptiness of death. This was her bedroom. But that was impossible. Everything was exactly the same as it had been years ago. The worn-out desk in the corner, the bookshelf filled with her old favorite novels, the faded posters of dreams she had long since abandoned. She turned her head slowly, her heart hammering as she spotted the small, scratched-up vanity mirror across the room. She forced herself to stand, her legs steady beneath her. Her hands shook as she reached for the mirror, her reflection staring back at her. And then she saw it. Her younger self.
No scars.
No injuries. No signs of the death she knew she had suffered. Her breath hitched. She stepped back, her chest rising and falling in quick, shallow movements. This isn't real. It couldn't be. But everything felt real. The warmth of the sunlight, the cool air against her skin, the weight of her own body. She was alive. And somehow she was back in the past. The realization hit her like a tidal wave, crashing over her, pulling her under. She squeezed her eyes shut, memories surging forward with brutal clarity. Her entire life had been spent trying to be enough, trying to earn love, to prove her worth, to make them see her. She had sacrificed everything for a family that had never once put her first. And in the end she had died for them. And they hadn't cared. Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not this time. This time things would be different. This time she wouldn't be the forgotten one. This time she wouldn't die for them. She clenched her fists, staring at her reflection, at the girl who had once been so desperate for love. That girl was gone. This time, she would live for herself. The first test came sooner than she expected. The sound of her mother's voice echoed down the hallway, sharp and impatient. She knew what was coming. The same routine she had endured her entire life. Go wake up your sister. Breakfast is ready, and she needs to eat first. Her mother's voice carried that same dismissive tone, the one that always made her feel like a servant in her own home. Before, she would have obeyed without hesitation. Before, she would have put her sister's needs before her own. But now? She didn't move. Minutes passed. She could hear footsteps, the growing frustration in her mother's voice. And then, just as expected, the door swung open. "What are you still doing in bed?" her mother snapped, arms crossed. "I told you to get your sister." She turned her head slowly, meeting her mother's gaze with a calmness that startled even herself. "She can wake up on her own," she said simply. Silence. Her mother blinked, taken aback. It was the first time she had ever talked back. The first time she had ever said no. "What did you just say?" her mother asked, her voice a mix of disbelief and irritation. "I said she can wake up on her own," she repeated, her voice steady. "She's not a child." Her mother's lips pressed into a thin line. "Don't start acting ungrateful. You should be grateful we let you stay here." That was it. The same words. The same reminder that she had always been an afterthought. But now she wasn't afraid of them. "Let me," she cut in, her tone sharp. "I live here just as much as she does. But it's fine. If you need someone to cater to her, find someone else. I'm done." The silence was deafening. Her mother just stared, as if trying to understand who this version of her daughter was. "You're being ridiculous," her mother muttered, shaking her head. "I don't have time for this. Just do as you're told." But she didn't move. And for the first time, her mother backed down first. The next few days were a blur of small changes that sent ripples through everything. She no longer jumped to help when they called. She no longer waited for their approval. She focused on herself. She ate first at the table. She stopped dropping everything for her sister. She spent her time doing what she wanted instead of what they expected. And the more she chose herself, the more she saw their discomfort. Her mother watched her warily, her father seemed confused, and her sister hated it. She had spent years living in her shadow, making herself smaller so that her sister could shine. Now she wasn't small anymore. And they didn't know how to handle it. Her sister tried to pull the same tricks, fake tears, whining, the usual manipulation. But this time, she just smiled and walked away. The shift was slow, but it was happening. They could no longer treat her like she didn't matter. Because she wasn't waiting for their love anymore. She was finally truly free. And for the first time in her life, she felt alive. But deep down she knew, the real test was still coming. The fire. The moment that had once stolen her life. She knew it was approaching. She knew the choice she would have to make. And this time, she wouldn't die for them. She would choose herself. And she would let them burn. The morning sun poured through her bedroom window, bathing the room in golden light. She stretched her arms and sat up, feeling an unfamiliar sense of peace wash over her. It had been weeks since she woke up in the past, since she was given a second chance to live life differently. At first, she had struggled with disbelief, questioning if she was trapped in some cruel dream. But now she had accepted it. This was real. And she was never going to waste another moment living for people who didn't care about her. She moved through her morning routine with ease, no longer rushing to make sure everything was perfect for her family. No more preparing breakfast before they even woke up. No more picking up after them like a servant. No more sacrificing herself for their comfort. Instead, she took her time, relishing the quiet, the control she finally had over her own life. It wasn't long before her mother's voice rang through the house. "Where's my coffee?" Before, she would have jumped out of bed, rushing to the kitchen to make sure it was ready before her mother even sat down. But today, she didn't move. Minutes passed and she heard footsteps in the hallway. Then her door swung open. Her mother stood there, arms crossed, irritation evident on her face. "Didn't you hear me? I asked for my coffee." She looked up from her book, her expression calm, unbothered. "And?" Her mother blinked, clearly not expecting this response. "And I asked you to do something." She smiled, closing her book slowly. "I'm not your maid." Silence. Her mother's face twisted in disbelief. "Excuse me." She stood up, stretching. "I said I'm not your maid. If you want coffee, make it yourself." Her mother's mouth opened and closed, as if struggling to find the words. She had never spoken back like this before. She had always been the quiet, obedient daughter, the one who never questioned, never refused. Not anymore. "You're being disrespectful," her mother finally snapped, her voice sharp. "After everything we've done for you." She let out a soft laugh. "Everything? Like what?" Her mother sputtered, caught off guard. She stepped closer, her voice steady. "Because from where I stand, all I ever did was give. And all you ever did was take." Her mother's face turned red with anger, but before she could respond, she brushed past her, walking out of the room with no regrets. For the first time, she felt light, unburdened, and she was just getting started. The changes were small at first. She stopped waiting on them. She no longer canceled her own plans to cater to her family's endless demands. She stopped letting her sister take credit for her work, calling her out every time she tried to manipulate their parents. She ate first at the dinner table, no longer serving herself last like she didn't deserve to exist. And for the first time in her life, she put herself first. The shift was immediate. Her family noticed. Her mother's comments became sharper. "You've changed." Her father barely spoke to her, as if punishing her with silence. And her sister? Her sister hated it. She could see the jealousy brewing in her eyes, the way she clenched her fists when she didn't immediately get her way. "You think you're better than me now?" her sister hissed one afternoon, slamming her bedroom door open without knocking. She didn't even look up from her laptop. "I don't think about you at all." Her sister's jaw clenched. "You're so selfish." She let out a small chuckle. Funny. That's what I used to think about you. Her sister glared. Mom and Dad are going to be so disappointed in you. She finally looked up, meeting her sister's gaze with calm indifference. I don't care. The words stunned her sister into silence. She used to live for their approval. She used to desperately crave even the smallest sign of affection from them. But not anymore. Her sister stormed out, slamming the door behind her. And she? She smiled. Because for the first time she was free. She threw herself into her dreams, her ambitions, her passions. She applied for scholarships. She focused on her career. She networked, studied, worked harder than ever before. Not for them but for herself. And the more independent she became, the more miserable her family looked. They were losing control over her. Her sister, once the golden child, couldn't stand it. She threw tantrums, she cried, she begged their parents to fix her, to make her the way she used to be. Her mother tried guilt. You're being distant. Family is supposed to come first. She raised an eyebrow. Funny, you never told my sister that. Her mother's mouth thinned. She needs more support than you do. She let out a cold laugh. And yet, I was the one who almost died for you. Her mother flinched. She didn't stop. She leaned in, her voice steady. I remember everything now. The fire. The way I saved her. The way I died. And the way you only cared about her broken leg. Silence. Her mother's face paled. That's ridiculous. That never happened. She tilted her head. Didn't it? Her mother couldn't meet her eyes. Good. Because this time she wasn't going to be their fool. She would never sacrifice herself for them again. And soon, she would make the final choice. Because she knew. She remembered the fire. She knew when it would happen. And this time, she wouldn't save them. She would let them burn. The house felt emptier now, colder somehow, as if the warmth that had once filled it had been nothing more than an illusion. She moved through the days like a ghost in her own home, watching as the foundation of their perfect little world crumbled around them. It had started with small things, little shifts in their routine, moments of tension that never seemed to fade. Her mother had always been the orchestrator, the one who dictated how things should be. But without her oldest daughter's quiet sacrifices, the cracks began to show. The laundry sat unfolded, meals were late, bills started stacking up. Her father, always detached, was growing more frustrated by the day. Without someone there to clean up after him, to fix his mistakes without question, he was forced to face his own inadequacy. And her sister? She was the most miserable of all. Without someone to cover for her failures, to whisper the right answers when she didn't study, to pick up the pieces of her tantrums, she had nothing left but her own mediocrity. You don't even care about this family anymore. Her sister spat one evening, arms crossed as she stood in the doorway of her bedroom. You think you're better than us just because you got a scholarship? She didn't even look up from her laptop. I don't think about you at all. Her sister's face twisted in rage. You're selfish. She let out a low chuckle. Good. Her sister stomped away, slamming the door behind her. The silence that followed was peaceful. She had spent years being their crutch, their servant, the one who sacrificed so they could thrive. And now? They were nothing without her. It should have been enough. It should have been satisfying to watch them fall apart, to know they were finally facing the consequences of their own selfishness. But there was still one thing left. One last test. Because she knew what was coming. She had known from the moment she woke up in the past, from the second she saw her reflection in the mirror. The fire. It would happen soon. She remembered the smell of smoke, the panic, the way her heart had pounded in her chest as she ran toward the flames. She had died for them. She had given them everything. And they had mourned her sister's broken leg instead. Now she had a choice. She could repeat history. She could throw herself into the fire once more, sacrificing her future for people who had never deserved her. Or, she could let it happen. She could walk away. The night it happened, the air was thick with tension. Something felt different. She watched from the kitchen as her sister scrolled mindlessly through her phone. Her mother fussed over something meaningless, and her father sat silently at the table, the usual tension pressing between them. She had always been the glue. Now they were coming undone. And then the smell of smoke. She froze. This was it. the moment fate had been waiting for. Her mother was the first to notice. "Do you smell that?" Her father turned toward the hallway. A flickering glow began to spread, casting shadows against the walls. Panic erupted. Her sister screamed. Her mother gasped. Her father shouted orders that no one listened to. Chaos. Just like before. She stood still, watching as it unfolded exactly as it had in her past life. The fire was growing fast. Smoke was filling the house, curling into the ceilings, pressing against their lungs. Her sister, helpless, pathetic, stood frozen in fear. Her mother reached for her. "Do something." The words felt like a cruel joke. "Do something? Like before? Like last time? Like when I saved you and it meant nothing?" Her sister coughed, taking a step back, eyes wild. "I can't breathe." Her mother turned to her, desperation in her face. "Help her." She felt nothing. No panic. No urgency. No pain. Just clarity. This was the moment that had stolen her future. This was the night that had ended her life. And now? She let it happen. She took a step back. Then another. Her mother realized it first. "You're just standing there," she gasped. "What are you doing?" She smiled. A slow, knowing smile. "I'm making a choice." Her sister's face contorted in fear. "You're insane. You have to." "I don't have to do anything," she interrupted smoothly. The flames climbed higher. This time she didn't run toward them. She turned and walked away. She didn't rush. She didn't panic. She moved through the house calmly, deliberately, knowing that this time, she wasn't going to be the one who burned. She reached the front door, stepping outside into the cold night air. The fire crackled behind her, smoke billowing into the sky. The screams rang through the house. Their screams. She felt no guilt.
No remorse.
They had spent her entire life watching her suffer. Now she was watching them. The neighbors would come soon. Firefighters. People who would try to put out the flames, who would do what she had once done. But this time, she wouldn't be part of it. She had already died once. This time she chose to live. The fire roared behind her, a deafening reminder of the night that had once taken everything from her. But this time, she wasn't trapped beneath the weight of burning beams. She wasn't gasping for air as smoke filled her lungs. She wasn't desperately reaching out for a family that had never once reached back for her. This time she was outside, breathing in the cold night air, watching from a distance as flames consumed the home she had once sacrificed herself for. And she felt nothing.
No panique. No regret.
No urge to run back inside and save them. She had done it before. She had given everything, only to be left to die. And they had not even cared. Her mother's voice rang out through the chaos, frantic, desperate. "Help us. Someone help." The words were eerily familiar. She had heard them before. Except last time they weren't meant for her. Last time her mother had been screaming about her sister, clutching onto her as if she were the only thing that mattered, while she had laid there, broken, dying, invisible. Her father shouted orders that no one listened to. Her sister's screams pierced the air. They were scrambling, terrified, trapped in the same helplessness she had once felt. And they had no one left to save them. She could hear them begging, calling for her, but she did not move. Her sister's voice was raw with panic. "Please, don't just stand there." She turned her head slightly, meeting her sister's wide, terrified eyes. The same sister who had taken everything from her. Love, attention, her very existence. She had once loved her, once believed that family meant something. Not anymore. Her sister stumbled toward the front door, coughing violently as smoke curled around her. She could barely see, barely breathe. The fire had already begun to consume the walls, creeping closer, its heat licking at the edges of the frame. The same house she had saved them from once before. This time she stood still. Her mother's eyes found hers through the thick smoke, wide with disbelief. "What are you doing? Help her." She didn't blink. Did they think she would still throw herself into the flames for them? That she would still give her life when they had proven, so cruelly, so clearly, that she was worth nothing to them? A bitter smile pulled at her lips. "I did," she said softly, her voice lost in the crackling fire. And then she turned away. Her mother screamed after her, but she didn't look back. She had already died once. She had already given everything. This time she chose herself. She stepped farther from the house, her shadow stretching behind her as she walked away, the sounds of their fear fading with every step. She heard the distant wail of sirens approaching, the frantic shouts of neighbors finally reacting to the chaos. They would try to save them, just like she had. But she would not. She had done enough. They had only ever seen her as useful when they needed her. They had only cared when it was too late. But now? Now they would know what it was like to be forgotten, to be left behind, to beg for someone who would never come. And she would never, ever make the mistake of saving them again. The night air was cold against her skin, but she barely felt it. The remnants of smoke lingered in the air, wrapping around the scene like a ghost of the past. The house that had once stood tall, filled with voices that dictated her every move, was nothing more than a blackened ruin. She stared at the wreckage unmoved as firefighters worked tirelessly around her, shouting commands, checking for final embers. But it wasn't the fire that interested her, it was them. Her parents stood off to the side, shaken, their expensive clothes ruined with soot, their hands gripping onto each other as if it would somehow bring them comfort. Her sister sat slumped against the curb, her face buried in her hands, her body trembling. They weren't speaking. They weren't even looking at each other. It was the first time in her life she had seen them without control, without the smug superiority, without the entitlement, without the certainty that she would always be there to clean up their mess. And for the first time they finally knew what it felt like to be alone. She had left them once when the flames had raged, when their screams had filled the air. She had stood at the doorway watching, making the decision she had never been able to make before. She had chosen herself. And she had walked away. Now, standing there watching them fall apart, she realized something. She had expected to feel satisfaction, maybe even victory, but she didn't feel anything at all. Her mother was the first to notice her. She turned her head, eyes still red from the smoke, her face twisted in disbelief. "You," her voice cracked. "You left us." She tilted her head slightly, watching her mother's lips tremble as she tried to process what had happened, what had changed. "So did you," she replied, her voice calm, controlled. "The night I died for you." Her mother flinched. Her father turned his head sharply, his jaw clenching. Her sister's breath hitched as she finally lifted her head. The weight of their gazes pressed against her, thick with unspoken words. She stepped forward, her presence suffocating them now, her footsteps slow, deliberate. "I sacrificed everything for you," she said, her voice unwavering. "I gave you my time, my love, my whole life. I died trying to save you." Silence. She let out a hollow laugh, shaking her head. "And what did you do?" No one answered. "You mourned a broken leg," she continued, her voice colder now. "You carried on as if I was just a problem that had solved itself." Her sister swallowed hard. I didn't mean." She held up a hand. "Don't." The single word cut through the air like a blade. Her sister shut her mouth, eyes wide. "You never meant anything," she continued, her voice sharp, precise, stripping them down layer by layer. "Except to take. That's all you ever did." Her father finally found his voice. "We didn't know." She laughed. A sharp, bitter sound. "You knew. You just didn't care." Her mother took a trembling step forward. "Please," she whispered. "We can fix this." "Fix this?" She tilted her head, considering the words. There was nothing left to fix. No love to salvage. No bond to repair. They had burned that bridge long before the fire. She exhaled slowly, meeting her mother's gaze one last time. "I died for you once," she said, her voice final. "I will never make that mistake again." She turned away, the same way they had turned their backs on her all those years ago. And this time she never looked back. The city felt different. Brighter. Freer. The weight she had carried for so long, the invisible chains of obligation and guilt, were finally gone. She had spent her entire life believing that she needed them, that their approval, their love, their validation was something worth chasing. She had been wrong. She had escaped them. And she had found herself. Her phone vibrated on the table beside her. A message from an unknown number. She didn't need to read it to know who it was from. She simply reached forward, pressed delete, and exhaled. The past was gone. She wasn't waiting for them to love her anymore. She wasn't waiting to be chosen, because this time, she had chosen herself. She took one last sip of her wine, set the glass down, and smiled. I once thought my family was everything. Turns out, choosing myself was my real salvation. The city lights shimmered like fallen stars, stretching endlessly into the horizon. The gentle hum of life below filled the air. A distant murmur of cars, laughter, conversations. An orchestra of existence that had nothing to do with her past. She leaned against the railing of her balcony, the cool night air kissing her skin, reminding her that she was free. For the first time in her life, she belonged to no one but herself. She ran her fingers along the rim of her wine glass, her movements slow, unhurried. Everything she had once feared, being alone, being forgotten, being unwanted, felt so small now. She had spent years chasing love that had never truly existed, bending herself to fit into a space that was never hers. And now, she was done chasing. The past had burned away, reduced to nothing but ashes, leaving behind a woman reborn in the fire. She glanced at her phone as the screen lit up, a familiar number flashing across it. She didn't need to open the message to know what it would say. Apologies, regrets, empty words from voices that no longer had power over her. She simply reached forward, pressed delete, and set the phone back down. The past was gone. She had walked away from it, had left it to burn with the life she no longer wanted. She wasn't waiting for their love anymore. She wasn't waiting to be seen, to be chosen, to be enough. Because this time she had chosen herself. She closed her eyes, breathing in the crisp night air, feeling the weight of everything she had carried for so long lift away. The guilt, the pain, the endless aching need for validation, it was all gone. They would survive without her. Or they wouldn't. It no longer mattered. She had saved herself. She had become her own salvation. She lifted the glass to her lips, taking a slow sip, savoring the taste, the quiet victory of finally being free. She smiled, letting the warmth settle deep in her bones. I once thought my family was everything. Turns out, choosing myself was my real salvation.